The motion for this debate is, this House believes that democracy should be a precondition for receiving international development aid. Without further ado, I call the House to order and invite the first speaker of the proposition to open the debate. Please welcome Lily.
$4,996.6 billion spent by America on foreign affairs in 2011. But where was this money spent? Ladies and gentlemen, the reality is some of this money was probably sent and spent funding corrupt regimes. And on this basis, we are so proud to propose a resolution. This House believes that democracy should be a precondition for receiving international development aid. And on side proposition, we're going to be bringing forth our case with three main contentions. Firstly, I'm going to be talking about the incentive to be democratic. Secondly, I'm going to be talking about preventing the corrupt regimes. And thirdly, my partner Grace is going to be talking about incorporating democracy in development. But before we go on to that, we're going to define some key terms today. This House is defined as the democratic nations of the world. Democracy is defined as a system of government where the party or person in power is elected every 2 to 5 years, and precondition is defined as a requirement. International development aid is defined as aid that is solely designed to build infrastructure, healthcare, education, and etc. We think that this excludes disaster aid, intervention aid, when country is under attack, and etc., which can be money or certain products. We think in order to implement this resolution, we think we have to the funding has to be from an established democratic country or the UN. We think government-run charities would have to follow this resolution. However, on the other hand, private charities could give aid where they choose because they are not under the jurisdiction of the government. And for countries in the process of becoming democratic, we think that they would need to show a significant progress and potential as they move closer towards becoming a democratic nation, a full functioning democracy, in which case we would provide more funding as they progress. Now, we think in order to win this debate today, we have to prove two things. Firstly, by doing this, countries that are not already democratic will now be incentivized to do so. And secondly, that democracy will help in the long run. Now, with that done, let's go into my first contention about this incentive to become democratic. Now, why is democracy important, and why are we justified to make this change? Well, firstly, we think it's important because it's the way the world has evolved and accepted certain ideologies of becoming democratic. We think you can interact better with other countries when you are democratic, and we think it's better for these developing countries. Secondly, we think the most powerful countries that are developed have become like a certain status in the world because they are democratic and because we know it works in society. And thirdly, because productive and contributing citizens create a better environment when they are in a democratic system. And lastly, because these oppressed people want democracy in these certain nations, we only think that dictators don't want it because democracy rules over them. We think of the example that people are rebelling, rioting in Libya, Egypt, Syria because they want democracy. We think that's the fundamental basis we have to stand on side proposition. So why is it important now? We think that we've been trying to focus on going towards a democratic society, but we don't think this has been working because we think it's important to take action, and because we are implementing this resolution, because we are now creating an incentive for these dictators to become democratic, we think that's what we have to stand on. Let's go into this incentive to become democratic. Let's look at what's happening in the status quo. When governments are giving certain dictatorships money, there's absolutely no reason for these dictatorships to change, right? It doesn't matter that these leaders are being a corrupt regime. It doesn't matter whatever the people say. Just as long as these countries are funding them, are supporting them, it doesn't matter. This creates no incentive for these people to change. These leaders are being rewarded for their actions. It doesn't matter if the countries say it's bad when after they pour their money into those bad dictatorships. And because of this, there's no incentive and quite frankly no reason for change. And right now, there's no reason for these dictatorships to continue. However, let's look at what can happen in the future with this resolution. When we take away this aid, after fostering them, it's now sending the message of you must stop and you must change to receive our aid again. We think of the example of Syria and Russia. We think the reason why Syria has no incentive and no idea of changing is because Russia is still supporting them through aid, right? We think if Russia were to stop funding Syria and send the message of changing, this creates the incentive. But before I move on, sure, I'll take you through
Deal with the fact that in some countries like Syria, if you have a democratic system, we see that whole system will fall apart because you have sectarian violence, you have tribal conflicts.
Okay, thank you very much. And we see in the world today, in society, we have evolved as a democratic nation. We have accepted the fact that democracy works in our world today. We think that's the basis that we have to go on. We think incentive is important because that's what creates development in certain countries. Let's move on to my second point about preventing corrupt regimes. We think that not only do countries have a right to not fund regimes, but we actually think it's not their ability and it's not like obliged for these countries to do so. But furthermore, with this implemented resolution, it now helps them, it now prevents them from doing so. It now prevents them from funding these certain dictatorships. And again, this creates the incentive, this creates the change we want to see within these certain nations. We think this is important for countries of democratic values to now prioritize that and stay true to their own values because now they are funding corrupt regimes. We think it's important to align with your certain values within your certain country and have a clear stance on what's right. We don't think it's like enough to say we don't like your dictatorship, but we have to go further and say we will not fund you until you have that incentive, until you are making progress as a democracy. We think that's very important. Right now, it's not enough to say it's bad. We have to actually make action because democracy does not form through just saying it's not okay. We think this resolution cuts off dictators, and we think that's important because now, in the status quo, they don't have any incentive, but right now, but in the future, when we do not fund them, they have no choice because no longer do they have money to progress as a nation. We think that's what they want as a dictatorship. They want to progress with power, right? Their people are now going to revolt because they know they do not have money, and when we fund dictatorships, what we're doing right now is we're furthering them and making them a more effective dictatorship, and that's not what we want.
Information, madam.
Not at this moment. We think we would prefer, because it is developmental aid, that we actually help progress that nation as a democracy and not help them further progress as a dictatorship. We think that goes against what we want to achieve as a global society, right? We think actually now we don't see the money given to the people. We think that's what's wrong with the dictatorship. The money is only given to the dictatorship in people in power. We think that's what's important. We think the money is not being given to the people, and we think through this, with change in democracy, that's what's going to change. So we think because we have to stop giving them aid, and now the dictators will start complying with our rules, with the idea of democracy, and now the people will find out that they don't have money and start revolting and start going against their leaders. We think this is important in today's case. And because we've shown you that we want democracy, and it doesn't just happen, but requires action, and thirdly, that countries will develop more effectively when they have a democracy, that we are so proud to propose a resolution. Thank you.
You guys spoke for 7 minutes and 35 seconds.
I thank the first proposition speaker for her speech, and now to open the case for the opposition, please welcome Manoj.
We think that people living in nations that lack good infrastructure but do not have a democracy are unfairly being punished by side proposition today. The situation that they were born into due to the birth lottery is seen as a reason why they should be punished on the basis that we are developing democracy. before we continue, there are two very simple questions which don't really fit into my areas of contentions which we have to ask. One, why is asserting the democracy over every other nation seem fundamentally as a good? That was a question that they never answered, although they told us repeatedly that democracy should be brought across. In fact, in my substantives, I'll tell you why democracy should not be brought across to some of these nations. The second question is regarding why necessarily will dictatorships bend over backwards to their demands, which is where we disagree with their notion that just because they are offering aid with the premise of democracy, that these dictators will be willing to take on this international aid, that they'll be willing to change. But this area will further delve in terms of the areas of contention. Before I continue, what is DDI's stance? We shouldn't let innocent people die by seeking to enforce our own principles upon them. A lot of the times the exact type of aid that we are talking about is development in terms of healthcare areas, things which are crucial to the survival of these people, which means that what we are doing is unfairly punishing them just because their system of governance does not align itself with our ideals. We think that we can always go through means such as external means such as international arbiters to solve this issue of corrupt governments that they opened up with. When they told us that some of the money doesn't always go to this exact region. We think that bodies such as the United Nations, through means such as, for example, UNICEF, can enter these nations and set up bodies on their own to make sure that whatever policy that side opposition today wants to bring across can be instituted effectively to serve the people. So that is why we deal with the more peripheral issues about corruption that we wanted to bring across. First area of contention. This is the psyche of these regimes, right? We don't think that everyone in the regime is a corrupt individual. Every regime is corrupt. We think that some are capable of distributing the aid to the people as well. But more importantly, our question is, why does the international community have the right to assert its ideals over these individuals? Often we see that these systems of governance are ones that have grown over time and that already have deep institutions within the nation. The question now is, what happens in terms of the development of democracy, assuming that they are somehow capable of making sure that dictators accept this democracy? Within these nations, they like the institutions that fundamentally support a democracy. Because you don't think it's just about electing people. It's also about having freedom of speech, allowing your state to bring across media and bring across messages to these people. All of these infrastructure means are glossed over by side propositions policy today. More than this, we think that dictators as it is have no incentive to reach out to the international community for aid. Even if they want to characterize it as a bleak war where there is no development, we think that dictatorships are perfectly fine with this because often they are harming the whatever profits that they have towards themselves. No, thank you, madam. What we see then is that they are increasing the barrier of entry even further for these dictatorships, meaning that they are preventing even these dictatorships from accepting international aid by forcing these ideals upon these upon these nations. What is the effect of this? It means that key developments in terms of infrastructure in areas such as healthcare and education are being denied to the people since dictatorships do not want to actually take on this international aid. This is where we reject all of the characterization coming out in the later part of their substantive about why dictatorships will necessarily take the international aid and why this is necessarily a good thing. Which is, the issue now is why dictatorships will stick closer to their ideals because they refuse to bend over what they would view as Western involvement in terms of the development of their nations. In terms of regimes, what we see then, no thank you madam, what we see in terms of these regimes is that they do not want to be influenced and controlled in terms of policies that they are bringing across today. So moving on into the second area, right? Why democracy is not as good as you want to bring it across. But this area is one that primarily leads into my substantive. So I'll give you the very basic level of response first. Democracy is not always suitable for every single nation, especially as Jonathan brought up, in terms of regions with tribes where there's already tribal warfare within these regions. We think that these are the areas where they will especially struggle to institute democracy due to the fundamental lack of institutions which can support the democracy. Before I continue into my substantive, yes madam.
Okay, don't you think that like a society that has conflicting tribes is going to get along better when you have a representative government instead of a totalitarian regime?
Societies with conflicting tribes currently cannot force themselves into power through violence because of this strong. What happens in their paradigm? They are forced to fight to the death over the power over these tribal areas, over these regions that they want, under the perception that is democracy. We do not think that just because you tell a tribal chief leader, look, you are in a democracy now, that he's going to stand up and give a speech to the people to win them over and take over the nation. What we think instead is the counterfactual, is that they will have a full-out war against one another, since there's no one there to stop them like there was in the form of the system previously. But let's look firstly in terms of three main lenses, in terms of why democracy is not as good as what you want to bring across. Why, firstly, the people and the government are fundamentally different. Even if side proposition dislikes the government, the people are innocents who are placed at risk due to the lack of the development aid that we are seeing today. What the international community does have is an imperative to defend the lives which have already been failed in their paradigm by these governments. What we see that is that even if the government is not the most capable at being able to invest into these areas of human rights, it should not be punished further by being denied the aid it needs to actually support its people. So what we are seeing then is that side proposition are denying the ability for these nations to support their own people and to support the development of their own nation. On the final level, right, international development aid, we think, is often critical to providing the environment for these people to live, allowing them to have a comfortable environment where they can progress and focus on other areas such as democracy. We think that what we are bringing across is that it is necessary for a nation to develop economically first and develop in terms of infrastructure before its people can focus on more peripheral issues such as democracy. To a poor man on the street, this issue of democracy is not as important as whether or not he can get healthcare for himself. But this area is one that will be further elaborated by my second speaker, Sarah Ting. So let's look in terms of the second scenario that we are discussing today. People might actually want their government to be non-democratic. What are we talking? This is where we reject more of the characterization coming out of side proposition. We think that in areas such as, for example, Cuba, where socialism is deeply respected and seen as the way forward, what essentially happens is that there is a rejection of these ideals on an arbitrary basis, preventing the development of these ideals within the nation, causing unhappiness regarding what necessarily should be the right form of governance. Essentially, you're rejecting legitimate forms of ideals based on your own arbitrary intervention. This is not what a democracy should be. The final and most critical area, however, is what I already introduced to you earlier on in terms of the rebuttals. Political havoc when you implement democracy within these regions. This is where we have issues, for example, when you bring across, for example, a proportional representation system into these regions. What happens is that tribal warfare essentially takes place. Because we are talking about democracies within areas such as Africa, for example, where there are often conflicting groups which are more than willing to take up arms just to get into power. What we are seeing then is that these strongmen who already existed, or these political systems, prevented this warfare by denying them power in the first place. These strongmen, with their rhetoric, with their capability to run the nation to some level decently whilst controlling all these conflicting tribes, managed to prevent the nation from falling apart. What happens when you force democracy upon these individuals is that the system collapses on itself, because firstly, there's no institution that is capable of upholding democracy. Secondly, the people themselves might not have the desire to uphold up this democracy. And finally, because the aim to take on the willingness to take on violence just to serve their needs is more than prevalent. For all these reasons, we are very proud to oppose.
I thank the first opposition speaker for his speech, and now to continue the case of the proposition, please welcome Grace.
Ladies and gentlemen, today we think we've seen a side opposition who fundamentally doesn't understand the difference between the short run and the long run. They've come up and they've tried to tell you, oh, all the detriments to the people in the short run now that we're not going to be able to provide them with aid. But we on side proposition are looking at the bigger picture. We see that in the long run, if we can impose a democracy on this country, the people are going to be better off in the long term for the rest of their lives, and it is on this basis that we are so proud to propose the resolution today. Alright, now before I delve into my constructive point today, this whole idea of incorporating democracy into development, let's take a look at what side opposition has brought up today in today's debate and show you a couple of flaws in their argument. Alright, so what have they really told us? Well, first, they asked us, why is asserting democracy over these countries good, right? We think that my partner Lily has actually already tackled this issue, right? We've proved to you 3 ways why democracy actually is good.
First of all, we know that it creates the most effective society, as I will be elaborating later on in my constructive point. But secondly, we would tell you that this is what the people of these countries want, right? We see that all of these developing nations that we're talking about today, a lot of them are revolting, they're uprising for what? Because they don't want their dictator anymore, they want a democracy, right? And thirdly, we think that if you do have a democracy, this is going to be able to create more discourse with the international community, with the countries who have the most power in today's society, such as, the United States, the UK, France, all of these different international players who are democratic, they're going to share the same values. So in this sense, we see that is why democracy is good. Then they came up and they told you, well, we shouldn't let innocent people die, right? We would like to tell you once again that we think that we're helping these people in the long run, right? We think that democracy fundamentally is going to help more than, say, giving them temporary aid, right? We think that when we give them a democracy, they're going to have a more stable life. They're going to be insured for life, that they're going to have all the proper access to like nutrition, to food, all of these other things. But furthermore, we think that they also don't have to live in fear of their dictator, right? Okay, then they came up and told us, well, democracy is bad because people don't like their government in a democracy. Ladies and gentlemen, what we would tell you is that these people in these countries that we're talking about probably don't like their dictator even more, right? They probably don't like getting oppressed even more than, say, having a liberal government who lets them vote, who lets them express their right to opinion, right? Okay, then they told you, well, we're denying the people of health, and that's wrong. We think that, ladies and gentlemen, the things that they're describing today can actually be achieved through other means, right? But we see that it's just that countries can't infringe on other countries' sovereignty, so we think that this is like why that's that. Okay, and lastly, they told us, well, we're going to have even more havoc with the democratic system, right? Because tribal groups don't like one another. Basically, what side opposition is telling you today is that we need a dictatorship to solve the problem, but because otherwise it's going to keep on fighting. But ladies and gentlemen, we will tell you is that when these people are equally represented in parliament, that this is going to appease them even more, right? This is going to let them come together, and they're going to be able to negotiate through other means. We think that under a dictatorship, they're not able to express their needs by any sort or form, right? And we think that they're going to keep fighting anyways, that this fundamentally isn't going to make a difference whatsoever. Okay, now with that done, let's get into a little bit of reconstruction today. So my partner Lily came up and she told you this whole idea about the incentive to be democratic, right? We think that fundamentally it's better to be a democratic, and we want countries to have this form of government, right? And we see that there's really no reason for corrupt dictators to change in the status quo because the countries are supporting this. What side opposition has really told us today is, well, dictators aren't going to take the aid anyways. Ladies and gentlemen, we on side proposition fundamentally believe that yes, they will, because these dictators in these developing countries don't have the means and they don't have the resources to be able to fund themselves, right? When they exhaust all of their funds, they're going to come running back to the international community asking for aid, and it is only through when we do that that we can actually impose change for the greater good of these people. And my partner Lily also talked about, how it's going to prevent corrupt regimes. We haven't really heard refutation from that from side opposition. We'd like to hear some of that in their second speech today. Okay, now with that done, let's take a look at my constructive point today. This whole idea about incorporating democracy in development, right? So we would tell you two things under this. First of all, why during the process of development? And number two, why is it that countries develop better when they're democratic? So let's take a look at the first question. Why during the process of development? Because we see that when something isn't fully built yet, it's the most malleable that we can shape it to be, right? We see that when these countries are developing, they're still really subject to change in the ways that they do things, in the ways that they govern their people, and the ways that they think, and the ways that they act, right? We see that things aren't really set in stone, but before I continue, sure.
What is the point of all of your long-term development towards democracy if everyone suffers and dies in the short term?
Okay, we think this is the whole idea of short-term benefit versus long-term gain, right? We think that ultimately, in the long run, it's still better, and we see that these people are still going to, the citizens of these countries are still going to get the aid that they need through charities such as Free the Children, Me to We, right? Ladies and gentlemen, so we see that in that sense, this is still going to happen. Okay, but delving back into my point, right? Why during the process of development? We think that when countries are developing, things aren't set in stone. We see lots of protests happening, revolts, riots. We think that fundamentally these countries' governments haven't built up a strong army yet or a strong government, right? We see that, for example, during the French Revolution, before they became a fully developed country, they went through not one, but two revolutions and the changes in government before they finally settled down, right? We think that ultimately, when we haven't set set in stone, like a set form of government, we are able to say change them and change them for the better, right? Just like how we go to art class and we mold a piece of clay, we know that it's simpler and easier to be able to shape and define the artwork that you're creating with your clay before it goes into the kiln and before it becomes set in stone, right? We know that in this sense, these developing nations are the clay that we're talking about, right? We know that we want to implement and we need to implement democracy before they've established their own form of government so that we can ensure peace and so that we can ensure the benefits in the long run. Okay, let's take a look at my second question today then, under this whole idea of incorporating democracy into development. So why is it actually that countries develop better when they're democratic, right? Well, ladies and gentlemen, we see that most of the nations in our world today, or the developed nations in our world, are democratic, right? But we see that to develop, you need everybody to be working together, otherwise there's going to be political turmoil and economic instability, right? So we see that unless we have a democracy, if we have a dictatorship in place, people aren't going to be working together, right? We see that the government is going to be stepping in and infringing on a lot of the rights of the people, infringing on like the rights of the capitalistic market. And we see that in this sense, unless the dictator somehow has a lot of money, they're not going to be able really to get their country to be able to develop, right? We take you the example of Uruguay. We know that Uruguay is considered to be one of the most developed nations in South America, and which we see that there are actually quite few developed nations. But we see that the reason why they're so developed is also because they have the most evolved democratic system, right? Again, we would take you to another example of the Industrial Revolution. We see that England actually became a parliamentary monarchy before they actually became developed, before they entered into their stage of an industrial revolution. We think that fundamentally you first and foremost need to become a democracy in order to be able to get your people to work together, in order to get your society to develop. And we see that dictators aren't actually helping their people succeed in this sense, right? We see that if we give them developmental aid, they're going to be able to spend their resources on other things, going to things where that is not going to be worthy of the people. And fundamentally, we think that it's because we want a democracy, that it needs a push to happen, and that it is a key to development that we are so proud to propose. Thank you.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 19 seconds.
I thank the second proposition speaker for her speech. And now to continue the case for the opposition, please welcome Sarah.
Can everyone hear me? Yeah. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, just because we think that something is good doesn't mean that we should impose it on everyone else. Just because we have a judgment of what kind of government is best for the people doesn't mean we should punish these people that we want to help just because their government doesn't listen to us. I have 3 main points of contention that we have with all of Proposition's assertions today. Firstly, is democracy a given good? Secondly, will their policy even help in the short term? And thirdly, on the idea of what is best for the people in the long term, something that their second speaker asserts is the more important one. Let's look at it one by one. Firstly, is democracy a given good? Now on their side, what have they told us about why democracy is the best? First thing they told us was that non-democracies are going to all be corrupt regimes. Is this really true? No, we don't think so. We think that there are many non-democratic nations that are not necessarily corrupt, that are not necessarily run by dictators. We'll give you the example of Venezuela, we'll give you the example of China, we'll give you loads of examples like Cuba, things that have come up in Manojo's speech that they neglected to deal with. So democracy isn't always the only way to move forward. But then let's look at the 3 main reasons why they told us democracy is good. And we're going to rebut this one by one. Firstly, they said it is the most effective society. Is this really true, ladies and gentlemen? Clearly, there are other ways to development and there are other ways to foster a good society without democracy. For instance, China, which is a leading superpower in the world. Contrary to what they say, that the best nations in the world are democratic, we think that China is a prime example of a counter model. But secondly, they say it's what people want. Really? Then they tell us that people are revolting. If people are revolting, we don't need to tie developmental aid to democracy. The people will get it on their own. We think that the Middle East is a prime example of this, where people are able to enact the change without our help. No thank you. Thirdly, on the idea of discourse with international community. Now this is the part that we really question, because just because I'm democratic, does that mean that I cannot talk to you if you're communist? We think that the only problem with that is your own unwillingness to negotiate and to cooperate with other nations. So we don't think that the problem is with these non-democratic nations, we think the problem is with the democratic nations themselves. So we don't think that you need to turn democratic in order to cooperate with everyone else. Second issue, will their policy help in the short term? This is where we question. Firstly, will dictators even accept your offer? Because we don't think they will. If these dictators, as they put it, as they characterize, are so unwilling to let go of their power, why will they let it go just because you put a price tag on it, just because they want to help the people? If they're so self-interested, they won't care if the people are not helped. But no thank you. Secondly, we really question what kind of democracy you're instituting, even if they accept your aid. Because we ultimately think that the reason these democracies will, these countries will not succeed if they are a democratic nation is because of the fundamental characterization of these nations. We talked to you about how there are 3 different kinds of nations in Manoj's speech, 3 different kinds of scenarios where democracy will not work for these nations. So we don't think it's beneficial for them at all. And furthermore, we don't think that the basis and foundation is set for these democratic nations, for these nations to thrive if they are in a democracy. For instance, things like voting booths, things like a rule of law that's respected, things like a civil society that wants to participate in the democracy and wants to vote. We don't think that this will entirely work on their side of the house. Now on the third issue, on the long run, this is where they talk about long-run development, where they talk about how, just because England adopted a democracy before they developed, therefore you must adopt a democracy before you can develop. We think that that correlation doesn't result in causation, but furthermore, we also think that ultimately it's better for you to develop before you democratize. This is something that ties in very nicely to my main substantive, and so I'm just going to integrate right into my main substantive here. My substantive for today is how, we have long-term growth. So I'll deal with this on 2 tiers. Let's look at the first one. We have long-term growth because of the counterfactual on that side of the house, i.e. what will really happen in their world. The thesis for this argument is that tying down developmental aid to democracies will drive dictators and countries away to seek aid elsewhere, which is comparatively worse. Why is this so? We don't think that they'll accept the aid, as we've already mentioned, because on the first issue, if they are really that open to democracy in the first place, then we don't see why, their country is not a democracy yet, given that they are the very governments that you have to change. But secondly, they will only perpetuate their own self-interest if they don't change their democracy. So then what other options do they have? Well, we think that the very countries that can give aid on a non-international basis, in the sense that you're not acting through the UN, is either USA, which is under their paradigm and will not work because they don't want to accept it. But also number 2, China and Russia, states that are not democratic and will want to offer you aid anyway. What is problematic about this? We think that it's problematic because these countries tie things to developmental aid as well. We give you the example of China, where in order to pump in investments into Africa, they actually tie it to the idea of getting back resources from Africa. And it's through this excuse of providing aid that they actually take all the resources from Africa and prevent the African people from actually using these resources. So they're exploiting Africa under the guise of developing it. But what is harmful about this? We think that ultimately, hold on a moment madam, dictators will still take this offer because it doesn't threaten their own self-interest, but it harms the people in the long run. But before I go into exact harms, yes.
Okay, so if this exploiting of the resources is so harmful, don't you think the country will realize that it's easier to appease the people and become democratic than give away all their resources?
Right. Firstly, we think that just because we think that the interests of the people and the interests of the government cannot be conflated. Right? What is best for the government in power might not necessarily be best for the people. This is why you have a ruling elite that oppresses everybody else. So we think that that necessarily doesn't make sense. But furthermore, we also think that what is bad for the people, in your paradigm, if the governments are really interested in that, then the countries won't really be as problematic as you put it, so there won't even be a problem in the first place. But let's move back to my harms, right? We're talking about how this harms the people because ultimately it will prevent them from profiting from these kind of resources that are now being exploited, which they can actually sell for a higher price on the global market. but also secondly, it hurts their long-term economic development, because after you develop your economy, you need a lot of resources to keep it running. We're talking about coal mines in Africa, we're talking about oil in Middle East, things that these superpowers will exploit for their own energy needs, but that will harm their country's long-term development. Then let's move on to the second tier of my analysis here, how prosperity breeds democracy. This is something that Manoj hinted at earlier, but I'm going to further extend. The thesis for this argument is that giving aid now would allow countries to develop and progress the country to a more mature society that begins to want democracy for itself. We think that ultimately, if you take that premise, that democracy is a given good, we think that it can be achieved by the people on their own. Why? We think that ultimately people are governed by a basic set of needs, a hierarchy of needs. They want basic needs like food, security, water, sanitation, things like that, education even, if you consider it, before they move on to more mature and secondary needs, such as a right to expression, such as a right to civil society discourse, things like that. So if we give them education now, we develop the infrastructure now, it will result in them wanting democracy in the future. We think a prime example is China, right? Where Deng Xiaoping actually wanted to develop the economy first before he moved on to, without liberalizing the political scene. And the result is now, people in China are starting to call for democracy, and they're slowly transitioning into it in a more peaceful and sustainable way, rather than a top-down approach. Ultimately, we think that organic change on the ground, because of the people, is better than the kind of top-down governmental approach that they want, the kind of policies that they foster on their side, that is not going to work in the short term, it's not going to be sustained in the long term, and will ultimately harm the people. So for all these reasons, I'm extremely proud to stand on opposition.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 7 seconds.
I thank the second opposition speaker for her speech. And now, to continue the case for the proposition, please welcome Tatiana.
Today, both side proposition and side opposition want to get aid to the people of developing countries. The difference is we see a realistic side proposition that realizes you can't get aid to people when you do it through a dictatorship. And it's because of that that we feel we really have the correct argument in today's debate, and that we're really going to take this debate. So I'll be analyzing it through 3 main themes. First of all, we'll look at the democratic countries and their responsibilities. Then we'll look at the receiving countries and how democracy could develop in them. And then we're going to look at aid and the people and what's the most effective way to get that to them. So let's start off with this idea of democratic countries. Now the first thing we heard kind of challenged from what we brought up is we told you democracy is a good thing. And what they told you in response is we can't really impose this idea on them. We need to go with what they want, and we can't just force them to become democratic. It might not work. The first thing we would say is this is actually our system, right? We are democratic countries, and this is our money, ladies and gentlemen. We don't have to use our democratically funded money to pay for a corrupt regime. That's not our responsibility. We're actually being very generous in funding them as is, but we think we do want to fund the people, and that's the problem. We can't continue to fund them through this immoral scheme when we're simply just funding a dictatorship. We need to find a more morally correct way that aligns with our own values, and that's through promoting democracy so that we can justify it morally within our budgets. Okay, secondly, they told you, but some people don't want democracy, and we told you it's benefiting the people. So the response was oh, they don't always want democracy, these people, it might not work. In return, we tell you, why is the Arab Spring happening, right, ladies and gentlemen? Why are people uprising all over the world asking for democracy? Why are they turning over their governments? Why is this happening if no one wants democracy? We think it's a pretty universal goal. We think it's what everyone wants. We think that the side opposition really can't just deny democracy. It's a pretty basic fact, ladies and gentlemen. So let's look at this idea of the responsibility of these countries. Now, the first thing they told you is we can't let people die just because they live in a dictatorship. And we think that we have the responsibility to save lives. And we agree. We do think that we need to help these people. But the way to help them is not by funding their dictatorship, right? It's not by giving their corrupt regime more money to strengthen it so that they continue to oppress the people, so that they can develop chemical weapons, so that they can kill more people, ladies and gentlemen. We don't think that's the way to help them. We think, yes, in the short term, they may get less money, but I'll actually be analyzing that in my third theme furthermore. But we think that in the short term, it may provide a certain amount of harm. But in the long term, when we can remove this and implement a democracy and help them develop as a country, less people will be dying, less people will be abused, and it will be a more effective system. That's what we on side proposition stand for. Okay, since you won't stop, sure.
Oh man, if that's the case, right, then shouldn't you instead be giving weapons, instead of using your this kind of barter trade to do with these dictators?
Sorry, should we be giving them weapons?
Yeah, instead of using this as a kind of barter system we should propose.
Okay, so they just said let's incentivize more war. Let's give them weapons so that they can go try to blow up their government, so their government can keep blowing them up and just keep going back and create war. Yeah. Thank you, side opposition. That's exactly what we want to do in a broken, developing country. That's great. Okay, so moving on. Then they told you, what's the point in long-term development if the people are going to die in the short term? We don't think people are actually going to die in the short term, because the problem is, and I'll be getting into this once again in my theme, people in these developing countries make a lot of money for themselves, actually. Like, what they survive on is what they provide, because the money that we give to these developing like, corrupt dictatorships actually goes into funding armies, right? It goes into imposing the military regime and keeping it strong. No, thank you. We don't think it actually goes into funding the people, so we don't think these people will be like dying. We think we have this greater responsibility to promote like global initiatives and to promote democracy and to save lives in the long run. So with that, let's move on to this next theme about will it actually incentivize democracies in these countries. So the first thing we told you in my first speaker's point is she told you in the status quo, we're just giving them money. We're just saying, oh yeah, you're a dictator, here's some money, here's your money. We're not actually stopping it, right? We're not telling them that it's not okay because we're saying we feel sorry for your people. The problem is that means no dictator has the incentive to stop, right? We think that when you stand firm and you say, we won't be giving you money anymore, and Lily explained this so well, we think that they have to change. Now, side opposition told you that's not necessarily true. They might not do this. The dictators are like horrible people and they'll continue to do this. Ladies and gentlemen, that's great. But what happens when the dictator runs out of money? They're not just pulling it out of their pocket, ladies and gentlemen. Dictators will eventually run out of money. They will not be able to like sustain their military. They won't be able to impose this regime on people. We think eventually it's going to stop. And there are two ways that this will happen. We think in scenario one, where they refuse to listen to us and don't revert to democracy, their people are going to realize that the reason they're not getting aid is because the dictator refuses to give up power. We think they will revolt. We think that's a negative scenario that the dictator will try to avoid. But secondly, we would say the dictator will realize that he needs the money and eventually he will cede to our claims, okay? We think that's like something that they need to do. It's self-preservation. Okay, and then so we analyzed that, and then they told us, well, essentially, in their third point, now they're going to be getting money from more dangerous places. We would say, first of all, the people in the country, once again, will revolt, right? If the dictator is essentially getting aid from companies that are ripping up their soil and like wrecking their entire environment, the people are going to get pretty angry, right? It's just going to create more anger towards the dictator. And when the dictator is running out of money, that's not what they're wanting to do, right? They're going to want to appease the people to keep from getting themselves killed. It's a pretty selfish principle, but that's how dictatorships run, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, so then let's look at this idea of increasing development. And they told you, well, people can get democracy for themselves, right? We don't need to actually push for that. We don't need to push for democracy. But what we would say is we have two responses to that. First of all, if they're doing this alone without the incentive, imagine if we added the incentive of getting more aid when you're democratic, right? We think that will make them more active. We think that would help them. No, thank you. But secondly, we would say we don't want to encourage war, right? We'd like to do this through a peaceful transition. We'd like to get the dictator to cede power when he's no longer getting any money for it. We would rather not have the people cause a massive war that lasts for over a year, as we've seen in Syria, and there's no signs of it stopping, ladies and gentlemen. That's what results when we don't do anything as an external party and refuse to intervene. Okay, and then they told you in tribal areas democracy is not going to really work. We'd say that that's because you're looking at it as a dictatorial view, right? You're saying one person can get power, so these tribes have been trained to think they must fight against each other to get power, and only one tribe can have power because one tribe has to be supreme. We think that eventually they need to get past that, right? We think that when you implement democracy, we can have a more representative system where all the parties can work together. We think that that might not be the ideal solution, but it's better than telling them they need to kill people to have power because they can't share power. That's not a good message to be sending. condescending. And then finally, we told you that democracy needs to be a part of development. You can't just thrust it in afterwards. And they brought up an example of China. We'd say that that's one in several. It's the exception, not the rule. Furthermore, we would say that it's pretty hard to just rip out the constitution from people, ladies and gentlemen. Once you have a fully developed country with a constitution that's like doing well, you're not going to be able to just say, oh yeah, by the way, we're going to take out your dictatorship that we've been making more effective with our funding for years, and we're going to implement a nice little democracy. We don't think that that's going to work as effectively. We think if you want a good democracy, it needs to be a part of the people as they're rising and becoming more developed. And finally, let's look at this idea of aid. What we think they fundamentally misunderstood on side opposition is how aid from governments work. We think that when you're giving aid as an external government, you need to do it through the government in the country you're giving aid to, right? Otherwise, you're impeding national sovereignty. You can't go to the people in the villages and say, here's a hut I'm going to build you, like I'm going to give you sheep and goats and give you a sustainable lifestyle. You can't do that because that's impeding sovereignty, ladies and gentlemen. So what they're reduced to doing is giving the government the money to the dictatorship and praying to God that that money is going to get through to the people. What we think is that this means not a lot of money is getting through to these people. That proves that these people can survive on their own, right? So we think this claim to people dying in the short term isn't very accurate because they're already living without aid. The aid is funding the dictator, and we think the dictator is going to die in the short term. We think the dictator is the one who's going to have to give up power, and we think that the people will eventually get aid that will actually get to them when we do it through a democracy, ladies and gentlemen. So it's because we believe that these people can take care of themselves, it's because we believe that the dictators are harming them, and it's because we believe that democracy just doesn't happen overnight, that it needs that extra push, that we are so proud to propose the resolution. Thank you.
Speakers spoke for 8 minutes and 12 seconds.
I thank the third opposition speaker for her speech, and now to continue the case of the opposition, please welcome Jonathan.
Can you guys hear me? Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Democracy was created to better lives of the average man by giving him more say. It is shameful that Team Canada suggests we use it as a tool to kidnap countries into submission, in turn harming the everyday men and women that we on side opposition want to save in today's debate. As the third speaker for today's opposition, I'll ask two very fundamental questions. Firstly, who better the lives of the people in the countries we are talking about? And secondly, who is morally superior? Firstly, who better the lives of the people that we're talking about? Before I delve into the question per se, I would like to point out that the other side of the house lacks the nuance that's supposedly supposed to have in today's debate. Why? Because the other side of the house debates as if we are setting out on a tabula rasa, right? Whereby everything is a clean slate and we are implementing democracy. We see that in those instances, perhaps democracy might be a good thing, right? But we see that in current situations that we are talking about, in countries like Africa, in countries like in South America, what we are talking about is that there's an existing structure in place. And when there's an existing structure in place, we can no longer debate in a vacuum that, like we are doing today, right? We see that when there's an existing structure in place, we need to take note of human behavior and about saving lives, right? Not so much about the principle per se, not so much about the argument per se, but who saves more lives. Something that they haven't done in today's debate. We see firstly, right, that the point of corruption is not really legitimate in today's debate. Why? Because firstly, we are not funding the governments in the debate that we are talking about today, right? They talk as if we are giving money hands over fist to the governments today, right? We don't think that's the case. We think that UNICEF or other aid organizations and development organizations can enter the country and give the people aid themselves, right? We think that another way to circumvent their point is that by giving aid, development aid in kind. No, thank you, man. And we see that the way that organizations, international aid organizations can do that is by telling the government of regimes and dictatorial systems that we are going to build for you a toilet or we're going to build for you a hospital, right? Instead of giving you the money. And when the government says yes, which they will, then we say that we can go in and build the hospitals and the toilets for them, right? So we think that their point of corruption doesn't necessarily stand. More importantly, we think that no thank you man, what happens on the other side of the house, right, is that if the people are already dying so badly, and we think that if the dictatorial system is so bad that the people have no levels of sanitation, no levels of healthcare, then we see that there will necessarily be a revolt, right? We don't think that that's necessarily true for all dictatorial systems, for all non-democratic systems, right? We give you the example of Venezuela, whereby the government went knocking doors of other countries to beg for milk, right? We see the government knocking on doors of the United States government, which clearly turned them down. That's why they had to turn to people like China for milk, right? We think that these people, we think that they mischaracterize the dictatorial systems that we are talking about today. More importantly, we see that even if we agree with all the boons on the other side of the house, we think that their case is unfeasible, right? We think that their policy will never be accepted on two levels. Firstly, they talk as if the dictators will suddenly rush in to take your development aid and give up their own power, right? We don't think that that's necessarily the case, right? We think that if the dictators are so bad, like you put it to be, then we don't think that they will necessarily care whether they have development aid or not, right? So we think that that's a misnomer on the other side. Rather, we think that it's very shameful that you try to barter with the dictators, that you try to say, you know what, maybe you can have a democratic system, but if you don't, it's okay. We'll let the people in your country die. Ladies and gentlemen, we think that it's bad. We think the sanctity of life is ultimately lost on their side of the house, right? More importantly, what actually happens in a debate is this, or what actually happens in the real world is this. Sarah brought up ideas of how people like China will step in to fund those countries, right? Sarah brought up how these regimes will necessarily turn to Russia to build their roads, to develop their country, right? We see that in these areas, what happens is that the long term that they are talking about is worse on the other side of the house. Why? Because we think that when China and Russia gives you development aid, they also want things back, right? They don't do it out as altruistically as the West will. What happens at the end of the day is that your resources will be under their care for the rest of its lifetime, right? And they say that, look, if the people see that happening, it will be bad and they will revolt. We don't think that's the case. Why? Because we think that the average man and woman in Africa doesn't know how much mine stockpile they have. They do not know how much coal they have in their country. Rather, all that matters to them is that they have food and water on their table. All that matters to them is that when they want to have a baby, they can go to the hospital and have a baby, right? We think that they are saying that, oh, we will know how much coal they have in their country. Doesn't necessarily say that. But before I move on, yes ma'am.
Okay, so in the current system, when we give money without impeding national sovereignty, because we can't do that, it goes to the dictator. Do you really think the dictator is going to build 20 hospitals?
Ma'am, this is where I say we can, there's a way to circumvent that, right? And I said that like 4 minutes ago, whereby all you have to do is to give them aid in kind, right? Whereby all you have to tell them is that I do not give you cash, hand over fist, but I agree that I'll build 10 toilets for you, or 10 hospitals for you, and I build the toilets for you, right? And the United States government, or the United Kingdom government will go there and build the toilets and the hospitals for you, right? So we don't think that your corruption point necessarily stands. More importantly, what the other side of the house likes to see, right, is that there are some people who do not want a democracy to start with, right? We see that if these people already wanted a democracy to start with, they're revolted. And the way that you will help them then is not by bartering with the dictator, but rather what you will do is that perhaps put economic sanctions on their country, perhaps supply them with weapons or supply them with other aid, right, that they possibly need. Not with trying to barter and trying to buy your way through it. We don't think that necessarily works. We think that point false. No, thank you. But more importantly, we see that even at the end of the day, if democracy is a very good thing, which we never see how, because you never told us how, and it leads to peace and prosperity. We see at the end of the day, we think that it is very naive to think that everyone will just accept democracy and it is a good thing because you say it's a good thing, right? We think that firstly, we have shown you that countries can be prosperous without democracy. We give you the example of China, whereby we see that China is a relatively rich country and the second largest economy in the world, right? This country was not democratic. This country was built from its foundations up. We think at the end of the day, democracy does not equal to prosperity. But more importantly, we see that in certain instances, which they have failed to realize, our paradigm is better. Why? Because we show you that in some instances, democracy or having a democratic system will cause infighting, right? We give you the example of Rwanda, whereby the Tutsi and Hutus, if you try to have a democratic system there, all that's going to happen is going to be infighting, whereby both systems will try to fight to the end of it. So when they fight to the end of it, at the end of the day, fundamentally, you don't have a democratic system. Because at the end of the day, the only person that you can vote into power will be a Tutsi or Hutu. So we think on that side of the house, they have failed to recognize that point, and we didn't deserve to lose on that point. But more importantly, this is nicely to my second question: who's morally superior? The reason why I left 1 minute for this point is because I don't think I have much to deal with it anyways. Why? Because they have fundamentally considered to us that it's okay if people die in the short run. We think it's not okay when millions of starving people in Africa, millions of starving people in Latin America die in the short run, right? We think that their side of the house, by totally ignoring the fact of the sanctity of life, deserve to lose the debate in any of itself. No, thank you, man, we're out of time. But more importantly, right, we think that because they have fundamentally left out the fact that people are going to die and saying that it's okay, we think that that is condemnable, and we think that on their basis alone we cannot give them this debate. At the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, the side opposition has been very clear. We are showing you very tangible, very realistic situations which they have obviously not wanted to debate on in this debate. So because I do not want another child to suffer from a poor sanitation or another baby to die in infancy, I'm immensely proud to oppose. Thank you.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 5 seconds.
I thank the third opposition speaker for his speech. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now move to the team's 4-minute concluding reply speeches. To deliver the opposition's reply speech, please welcome Manoj.
To the average man in the nations that we're talking about, he isn't very concerned about what type of nation he is in, about what type of democracy or what type of governing he has. We brought it out to you clearly today that he barely has his most basic fundamentals in terms of rights. We're talking about things such as healthcare, in terms of education, things that we can easily afford to them through international bodies such as the UN, which is more than allowed to enter these nations with their accord to help in areas such as setting up clinics for them. And what happens for these individuals is that side proposition walks in for them, brings democracy to the entire nation, and supposedly improves their situation without telling us how exactly, firstly, that they're going to improve the situation, or why necessarily this is better, or why necessarily they're better. So we're going to show you why side proposition have failed today in terms of bringing betterment to the people, and secondly, why side proposition have failed today in terms of improving systems of governance in these nations. The first question, in the first area, right, where we are taking down most of the broad characterizations that they brought across in terms of their case. We told you simply that dictators have no incentive to just give up their power for the purpose of development aid. That came out very early on in our case. The critical thing about this is that whatever they've told us today, across all their substantive speakers, is the wonders of democracy. Wonders of democracy that we all agree with. But what opposition has constantly been questioning is whether or not we will take these dictators, will take the path to these forms of benefits that they want to talk about. Dictators do not have any incentive to take on the help that they are talking about today, because they're just giving up power without having any benefit towards themselves. On the second level, the area which they primarily ignore, they're not actually stonewalling the inflow, or they are not stonewalling the inflow of money into the nation. This is where opposition characterizes to you that what instead happens is that they seek money from other forms, through other forms such as through people such as Russia and China. The necessary harm here is that very harsh attachments are attached to these policies, such as starving you of your land, such as being able to exploit your resources, such as being able to take advantage of your labor to develop their own goods. Why is this necessarily worse? Rather than they are offered this aid through the international community, rather than for them having to give up all of their land just to afford this exact same international aid. So in terms of the construct that side proposition have brought to you today, what they have is an international body which very proudly tries to bring across democracy, instead fends away everyone and forces them to lose out all of their resources to nations such as Russia and China. On the final level, right, in terms of what the only area where they fundamentally criticize us, they told us, look, money is being thrown around to these dictators. This is a very big problem that we need to deal with. Infrastructure development means you allow for these nations to step in and build a hospital, build toilets, because Jonathan seems to really like toilets in this debate. You build such forms which you cannot necessarily corrupt because they are buildings which you use to serve good. We don't see how this whole corruption thing stands on their side of the house. Also, the issue of this debate, when we had almost no response for, which is why I left it out to a bit later. Why democracy will still necessarily fail in their paradigm? Very simple characterizations. People do not desire democracies. Places such as Cuba, where they already respect the socialist system, where it is ingrained in them to live in this way, they do not desire. On the second level, we told you that there is no democratic institution already in place to sustain what they are trying to bring across today. This is where Sarah's substantive really came in critically, where she told you only when you remove these basic lackings that they already have can they focus on more periphery issues such as this freedom of speech or such as other democratic principles that they want to discuss today. Meaning that in both situations, the democracy that they are constructing falls on itself. Final level, in terms of tribe warfare, these individuals who have no experience with rallying people go out to kill each other and damage each other just to gain power over the nation under this perception of democracy. These people lose their lives due to side propositions, belligerent stance of trying to assert its principles upon these nations. For all these reasons, we are very proud to oppose.
Speakers vote for 4 minutes and 11 seconds.
I thank the opposition reply speaker. And now to conclude the case for the proposition and the debate as a whole, please welcome Grace.
We've seen a side opposition today that wants a world in which children don't die and people don't go unsanitized. And we agree. We don't either. But we think that under their system, that's exactly what will happen, because the money that we give to their governments is going to be used to line the dictators' pockets instead of helping out the common person. So today, we on Side Proposition have summed the debate down into 3 key questions. Number 1, do we need democracy? Number 2, will it be effective? And number 3, is it fair to the people? All right, let's move on into my first question today. Do we actually need democracy? So Side Opposition has come up and they told you no, countries can develop in other ways, and they cited the example of China. We'd ask them, ladies and gentlemen, then, if they could cite another example other than China, because we've told you that China is the exception, right? We do see that in the majority of cases, countries develop the best when they're under a democratic system, right? But furthermore, they've also told you, that we can't impose democracy on other people. We would tell you, ladies and gentlemen, is that this is our money that we're giving to these people, right? This is our system, and we don't think that we want to fund a corrupt regime if we are democratically, if we have a firm democratic belief, right? We think that we want to help the people, yes, we agree with that, but we will only help them if our principles align, if our principles are the same, which is why we want them to transform into a democracy. And then they told us, the common man doesn't care about a democracy, or they don't care if they live in a democracy or a dictatorship. What we would tell you is that this actually isn't true, right? We've seen so many uprisings and revolts where all of these things do show that the common man does care, that they don't want to live under a dictatorship. But furthermore, even if that were true, we think that the common society actually wants a democracy, not a dictatorship. All right, moving on to my second question, is it going to be effective, right? So Side Opposition today has tried to tell us, well, dictators aren't going to take the aid and they're not going to stop. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we on Side Proposition have proved to you that actually they will, right? Because they can't sustain themselves. That people are either going to revolt or the dictator is going to recognize it, so ultimately the dictator is going to come back and ask for this money, right? And they've told us, well, we can give these money to dictators in other ways, right? Such as in the forms of objects, such as like toilets and like houses and other things. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we think that as an outside country who doesn't know the country's inside affairs, it's not really our place to be determining whether or not we can give them a certain amount of things, right? We see that also, not everything is just an object, right, ladies and gentlemen? We think that a lot of aid they actually need in monetary things so that they can go to other things that aren't simply objects, some things that we can fund for, right? Then they've told us, well, the dictators are going to get money from more dangerous places. No, again, Partner Tatiana has told you that people are going to revolt. Then they told you, well, people are going to move to democracy anyway, so why does this resolution matter? Ladies and gentlemen, it matters because this is going to incentivize the dictators to move into democracy without bloodshed, right? We don't think that revolutions are a good thing. We don't want hundreds upon thousands of lives being lost in a revolution trying to get democracy. We think that if we can find a peaceful solution for it, then that's the best that we could possibly possibly do. Okay, now let's take a look at my third and last question today. Is it fair to the people? And today they've tried to say, well, you know, it's not fair to deny the people to the right to life and healthcare. And we've given you a plethora of responses to this, right? First of all, we've told you that when they're already being denied of these things, then they've already learned a way to live through this, right? We think that the dictators right now are taking their money, and these people are still finding a way to survive. So even without the, even if they think that these people are going to die in the short run, that's not fundamentally true, right? The people are surviving, but if we can give them this extra money, that is going to make their lives that much better. And we've also told you that, you know, we want to help, however, we don't want to help them through their dictators, right? We don't think we want to give money to their dictators so that they can go and develop their army, develop chemical weapons, that could come back and that could help their people. We don't think that this is the right way to help their country. And ladies and gentlemen, it is because of all of these proposed reasons so far, we've taken down side opposition's case that we are so proud to propose the resolution. Thank you.
Speaker has spoken for 4 minutes and 7 seconds.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending the debate. We congratulate both teams for reaching the semi-finals and wish both teams the best of luck. The verdict and the team moving on to the grand finals will be announced at Lecture Theatre 2, so please return to Lecture Theatre 2 or the adjudicators to deliver the verdict. Thank you.